Forget the lie that the Ottomans were just conquerors. They were masters of psychological torture, and their favorite weapon was the Christian nun. They didn't just kill them, that would have been too merciful. Instead, they perfected a system of public humiliation, forced conversion, and sexual enslavement. The goal was singular and brutally clear: to prove in front of everyone that God was powerless to protect his own brides, and that the souls of the conquered now belonged to their new masters. This wasn't random cruelty in the heat of battle. This was a calculated, cold-blooded state policy, spiritual murder elevated to an art form. Now, picture the scene that follows this policy. A convent where the air, once thick with incense, is now choked with the stench of blood and smoke. The sacred silence has been shattered by the guttural shouts of soldiers and the shrieks of women being dragged from the altar. Their wimples are torn from their heads, their rosaries trampled underfoot by muddy boots. These women, living symbols of purity, are now just another piece of plunder, their sanctity serving only as an aphrodisiac for their violators. The sanctuary has become a slaughterhouse, and the altar a stage for abomination. But this disgusting ritual of defiling the holy wasn't just the whim of a few rabid soldiers. It was the symptom of a disease, a calculated strategy that had infected the entire Ottoman system of power to its very core. So how did they build this perfect machine of depravity? And who is really pulling the strings? The answer is even filthier than you can imagine. To understand the machine, you must first meet its architects. Look no further than the man they call the Conqueror, Sultan Mehmed II. Don't picture the regal figure from the portraits. Picture a monster of ambition, a predator whose hunger for power was matched only by his contempt for the faith of his enemies. History remembers him as a Renaissance man, a polyglot who studied science and poetry. What a sick joke! This scholar was the same man who unleashed his hordes on cities with the explicit promise of 3 days of unrestrained plunder. He knew exactly what that meant. It meant rape. It meant enslavement. It meant turning his army into a pack of ravenous wolves and pointing them at the throats of the innocent. Mehmed wasn't an anomaly. He was the apex predator of a system that bred monsters. His pashas and generals were cut from the same blood-soaked cloth. Men like Zagan Pasha, a man of Christian birth, ripped from his family by the Devrim system, who then turned with fanatical zeal against his own people. These weren't just soldiers following orders. They were opportunists, careerists in the business of brutality, who understood that cruelty was the fastest ladder to power and wealth. For them, a nun wasn't a woman of God. She was a premium spoil of war, her violation a mark of status, a testament to their dominance. Their personal hypocrisy was breathtaking. These men would perform their daily prayers, citing the Quran and posturing as defenders of their faith, and then preside over slave markets where thousands of Christian women and children were sold like cattle. They would fund the construction of magnificent mosques with wealth plundered from desecrated churches. This wasn't a conflict of civilizations. It was the work of a ruling class of sociopaths who had weaponized religion to justify their insatiable greed and sadistic impulses. They were the orchestrators of the symphony of screams that echoed through the conquered lands, but a few jackals acting in the shadows is one thing. What happens when they turn their personal sickness into the law of the land? What happens when the entire mechanism of power, from the courts to the military, exists only to legitimize and facilitate their perverse desires? That's where the real nightmare begins. How did they get away with it? They didn't just get away with it. They legalized it. They perfected it. They built a machine for it. The engine of this corruption was powered by a toxic fusion of twisted legal justification, psychological warfare, and a military system designed to erase human empathy. It was a cold, calculated system of dehumanization that made atrocities not just possible, but inevitable. First, they gave it the veneer of law. Under their interpretation of the laws of war, the inhabitants of a city that resisted conquest were forfeit. Their lives, their property, and their bodies became ghanima, spoils of war, legally belonging to the conquerors. This wasn't chaos. It was codified theft and rape on an industrial scale. A holy woman, once a revered figure in her community, was legally reclassified as property the moment the city walls fell. She became an object, no different from a sack of grain or a piece of silver, to be distributed by military command. The system provided the perfect alibi. They weren't committing crimes. They were simply collecting what was legally theirs. Second, this was masterclass psychological warfare. Why the specific, relentless focus on nuns and convents? Because they were the spiritual heart of their enemies. Nuns were the living symbols of Christian faith, chastity, and devotion, the brides of Christ. To violate a nun was to symbolically rape her God. To turn a convent into a brothel was to scream a message to the conquered: your faith is powerless. Your God cannot protect his own brides. Your entire spiritual world is a lie, and we now own your souls. Every act of desecration was a calculated blow aimed at shattering the morale, identity, and will to resist of an entire population. It was conquest of the mind, achieved through the brutalization of the body. The final gear in this machine was the army itself. The elite janissaries, the terror of Europe, were the ultimate expression of this system. Most were born Christians, stolen from their families in the Balkans as children through the Devurm system. They were forcibly converted, indoctrinated, and brutalized until their past was erased, their empathy scrubbed away, and their only loyalty was to the Sultan and the state that had unmade them. These men, products of a crime against humanity, were then unleashed to commit further crimes against people who looked just like their own forgotten brothers and sisters. It was a self-sustaining cycle of trauma and violence, creating the perfect, unthinking instruments for the empire's dirtiest work. This systematic dehumanization was the engine of their empire. But it was during the fall of one specific city, the jewel of Christendom, that this engine would be revved to its absolute limit, resulting in an explosion of depravity that would scar the memory of the world forever. May 29 th, 1453. This was the day the mask of civilization was ripped from the face of the Ottoman war machine, revealing the snarling monster beneath. This was the fall of Constantinople, the queen of cities, the heart of Eastern Christendom for over 1,000 years. And its fall wasn't a noble battle between empires. It was the moment a meticulously designed system of cruelty was finally unleashed in its purest, most unrestrained form. For the women consecrated to God within its walls, it was the beginning of the end. When the massive Ottoman cannons finally shattered the ancient Theodosian walls, it wasn't just stone and mortar that crumbled. It was the barrier between order and absolute savagery. The promise had been made by Mehmed himself: 3 days. 3 days for the soldiers to take whatever and whoever they wanted. This wasn't a bug in the system. It was the primary feature. It was the salary, the bonus, and the motivation all rolled into one. And they swarmed into the city not as soldiers, but as a tide of human locusts, ready to consume everything in their path. They headed straight for the wealthiest places, the palaces, the mansions, and the churches. And inside the churches and convents, they found their most prized treasures. Eyewitness accounts, written by those who survived the horror, describe scenes from a nightmare. Nuns who had been praying for a miracle at their altars were roped together by their wimples and dragged out into the streets. Holy sanctuaries, places of quiet contemplation for centuries, were transformed into scenes of mass rape within minutes. The priceless icons were hacked apart for their gold frames, ancient manuscripts were used as fuel for fires, and the consecrated hosts were trampled into the dirt. They flooded into the Hagia Sophia, the grandest church in all of Christendom, where thousands of civilians had taken refuge, believing its holy walls would protect them. They were wrong. The priests who were performing a final mass were cut down where they stood. The old and the sick were slaughtered without a second thought. The young, men, women, and children, including every last nun who had sought shelter, there were bound and herded out, destined for slavery or worse. The last service in the Hagia Sophia ended not with a hymn, but with a tidal wave of screams. The point of no return had been crossed. The city was a bleeding carcass, and the vultures were just getting started. The soldiers took their fill of flesh and gold. But for the Sultan himself, for the architects of this new world order, mere physical violation wasn't enough. They had a final masterpiece of humiliation planned for the holiest women of the fallen city. An act designed not just to break their bodies, but to annihilate their souls and erase their God from the history books. And so we arrive at the final abomination, the act that truly was worse than death. The screams of the initial assault faded, but the horror was far from over. For the captured nuns, the true nightmare was just beginning. Death would have been a release, a martyrdom. What they received instead was a living damnation, a systematic erasure of their very being, staged as a public spectacle of Ottoman triumph. The first act of this spiritual annihilation was forced marriage. Think about the profound evil of this act. A nun is, by her sacred vow, a bride of Christ. It is the core of her identity. The Ottomans understood this perfectly. They took these women, dragged them from their desecrated cloisters, and forcibly married them to the very soldiers and officials who had slaughtered their communities. They were compelled, under threat of torture and death, to renounce their holy vows and submit to a life of servitude to their captors. Every single day of their new lives was a new rape, a spiritual one. They were forced to bear children for their enemies, raising them in the faith of the men who had destroyed their world. Their past life, their holy purpose, was not just ended. It was mockingly inverted. The bride of Christ was made the property of a killer. For those not chosen for this special brand of hell, there was the slave market. Imagine the scene: women who were once revered spiritual leaders, scholars and pillars of their society, now stripped naked on a wooden block. They were prodded, inspected, and priced like livestock. Their bodies, which they had consecrated to God, were now subject to the leering gaze and filthy hands of merchants and soldiers haggling over their price. They were sold and scattered across the empire, from Anatolia to the Balkans, their names forgotten, their vows turned to dust. This was the complete and utter liquidation of a person, a reduction from a sacred being to a piece of merchandise. It was a death of the soul, a daily existence where the only memory of a holier past was a source of unending torment. This wasn't just random cruelty. It was policy executed with cold precision. The entire spectacle was a carefully orchestrated piece of political theatre. Mehmed made a point of preserving some of the Christian hierarchy, a cynical act of tolerance to ensure a compliant tax base. But the fate of the nuns sent a much clearer, more brutal message to the survivors: your spirit is broken. Your God is defeated. Your holiest women now belong to us, to serve our needs and bear our children. Your civilization is over. We are your reality now. And when the last woman was sold, when the last convent was emptied, a quiet fell over the ruins. But in this quiet, the second phase of the crime began: the meticulous, cynical process of hiding the bodies and rewriting the history into a tale of glorious, enlightened conquest. Every monster fears the dawn. But for the perpetrators of this abomination, there was no dawn of reckoning. There was no justice. There was only the sound of court historians sharpening their quills, ready to spin a web of lies that would last for centuries. The final, and perhaps most insidious, crime was the utter whitewashing of this horror from the official record. The history of the conquest was immediately rewritten. Mehmed the Conqueror, the butcher of Constantinople, was rebranded as a paragon of wisdom and mercy. Historians, both Ottoman and later, fawning Western apologists, focused on his magnanimous act of sparing the new patriarch. They marveled at his patronage of the arts and his supposed creation of a multicultural, tolerant empire. The 3 days of systematic rape, slaughter, and enslavement, that was dismissed as an unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of 15th century warfare, a regrettable footnote to an otherwise glorious story. The fate of the thousands of women, especially the nuns, whose violation was a deliberate act of policy, was erased entirely. They became nameless, faceless statistics, their suffering deemed irrelevant to the grand narrative of empire. The perpetrators weren't punished. They were rewarded, given titles, lands, and the very women they had brutalized as their personal property. There was no justice then, and there has been no true accounting since. The system they perfected, the engine of conquest powered by codified rape and psychological warfare, didn't end with Constantinople. It was a model that was applied again and again as the empire expanded into the Balkans and beyond. The suffering of these women was not an aberration. It was foundational. Their broken bodies and shattered souls were paving stones on the road to Ottoman glory. The silence that surrounds their story in mainstream history is not an accident. It is the final victory of the criminals. It is proof that if your crime is big enough and you win, you get to write the history books. In the end, their empire of filth crumbled into dust. But their legacy? Their legacy is a poison that still seeps into the ground we walk on today. They perfected the blueprint for using systematic sexual violence as a weapon of war, for targeting cultural and spiritual symbols to break a people's will, and for the cynical rewriting of history to wash the blood from the conqueror's hands. This poison is immortal. We saw it in Bosnia. We saw it in Rwanda. We see it every time. A propagandist rebrands a massacre as a glorious victory. The Ottomans taught the world a lesson. Not about justice, but about how much evil humanity will tolerate and even celebrate in the name of power. And if you think their time is over, if you think we've learned anything at all, you haven't been paying attention.